The chandeliers shimmered like frozen stars above the ballroom. Crystal glasses chimed softly in rhythm with quiet laughter. Silk gowns whispered against polished marble floors. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. And then the doors opened. The massive oak doors at the entrance swung wide, and for a moment, nothing happened. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. The kind that tells you something is about to shift. The music slowed. Not stopped, just faltered, as if the violinist's hand had hesitated. The laughter thinned, conversations collapsing mid-sentence as heads turned toward the entrance. 200 of New York's most powerful people, all dressed in their finest, all frozen in place, staring at the doorway. Because standing there, framed by the golden light of the corridor behind him, was the last man anyone expected to see. Not a billionaire. Not a senator. Not a celebrity or a mogul or anyone who belonged in a room like this. But the woman's driver. The same man she had invited as a joke. The same man she had mocked over champagne and laughter just days before. The same man she was certain would never, ever dare to show his face here. Yet there he stood. Calm. Composed. Shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward. He wasn't wearing the ill-fitting borrowed suit they expected. He wore a tailored black tuxedo that fit him like it had been made for royalty. His shoes gleamed. His posture was perfect. And he carried a presence, something quiet but undeniable, that made the entire room hold its breath. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was something far more powerful. Dignity. And in that single, suspended moment, the rich lady, standing near the center of the ballroom with a champagne flute halfway to her lips, felt her heart drop into her stomach. Because she realized something terrifying. This night was no longer under her control. This man, this driver she had dismissed and diminished and treated like furniture for 7 years, was about to change everything. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Stay with me, because what happened next would expose secrets buried for decades, shatter reputations built on lies, and force every person in that room to confront a truth they had spent their lives avoiding. This is not just a story about a joke gone wrong. This is a story about power, about pride, about the dangerous, costly mistake of underestimating another human being. And by the end, you will understand why silence is not weakness. Why humility is not defeat. And why the people we overlook are sometimes the ones who hold the most power of all. Before we go any further, I need to know you're ready for this. Because this story is going to take you places you didn't expect. It's going to make you question things you thought you knew about people, about justice, about what really matters in life. So right now, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you're new here, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because we don't just tell stories here. We tell the stories that stay with you, the ones that make you think differently, the ones that remind you what it means to be human. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get back to that ballroom. Now, let's get into how this all began. Her name was Evelyn Harrington. And if you ran in the right circles, in the towering glass offices of Manhattan or the charity galas of the Upper East Side, that name meant something. It opened doors before you even knocked. It got you tables at restaurants that didn't take reservations. It made people lean in when you spoke and remember what you said long after you left the room. Evelyn was born into wealth, the kind that doesn't shout but doesn't need to. Her father owned a commercial real estate empire that stretched across 3 states. Her mother came from old Virginia money, the kind with portraits in museums and streets named after ancestors. Evelyn grew up in a townhouse that overlooked Central Park, attended private schools where tuition cost more than most people's salaries, and summered in the Hamptons where she learned to sail and play tennis and speak 3 languages fluently. She was groomed for greatness. Polished. Refined. Taught that the world was hers if she simply reached out and took it. And she did. At 23, she married Charles Harrington, a finance executive 15 years her senior whose family name carried as much weight as her own. Together, they became a power couple. They hosted dinner parties for senators. They donated to museums and hospitals and universities. They appeared in society pages, always smiling, always perfect, always enviable. To the outside world, Evelyn was gracious, generous, elegant. She chaired charitable foundations. She spoke at fundraisers. She wore designer gowns and said all the right things about giving back and lifting others up. But behind the perfect smile, behind the carefully crafted image, lived something else. A quiet arrogance. A belief, unspoken but deeply rooted, that the world was divided into two kinds of people. Those who mattered. And those who served. Evelyn never said it out loud. She didn't have to. It was in the way she looked past waiters when they refilled her glass. In the way she forgot the names of housekeepers who had worked for her for years. In the way she spoke about people, not to them, as if they existed only as background characters in the story of her life. She wasn't cruel, not in the obvious way. She didn't yell or insult or demean. She simply didn't see people beneath her station as fully human. They were functions. Tools. Necessary but forgettable. And among those forgettable people was Samuel Carter. Her driver. Samuel had been driving for Evelyn for 7 years. 7 long, quiet years. Every morning, he arrived at her townhouse at 6:45, exactly 15 minutes before she needed to leave. He opened the door of the black Mercedes. He waited, silent and still, as she settled into the back seat, usually on her phone, rarely acknowledging his presence. He drove her to meetings, to lunches, to charity events, to her yoga studio, to her hair appointments. He knew her schedule better than she did. He anticipated her needs before she voiced them. And he did it all without complaint, without conversation, without ever inserting himself into her world. To Evelyn, Samuel was just the driver. She didn't know his last name for the first 2 years. She didn't know if he had a family. She didn't know where he lived or what he did when he wasn't driving her around. And she never asked. Because she didn't care. To her, he was a function. A service. As replaceable as the coffee she picked up every morning, as unremarkable as the air she breathed. But Samuel Carter was not unremarkable. He had a story. A past. A life that Evelyn could never have imagined. And it was a past that would, one night, walk into her carefully controlled world and shatter every illusion she had built. Samuel wore the same rotation of dark suits. Navy. Charcoal. Black. Always pressed. Always clean. His shirts were white, his ties muted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He kept his hair trimmed short, graying at the temples in a way that might have made him distinguished if anyone had bothered to look. But no one did. He had a face that blended into the background. Kind eyes that rarely met anyone else's. A posture that was upright but unassuming. He was the kind of man you could stand next to for an hour and not remember 5 minutes later. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because Samuel had learned, through pain and loss and betrayal, that invisibility was a kind of armor. If no one saw you, no one could hurt you. If no one knew your story, no one could use it against you. So he drove in silence. He listened to Evelyn's phone calls, her complaints, her gossip, her plans, and he never reacted. Never commented. Never gave any indication that he was anything more than a pair of hands on a steering wheel. And for 7 years, that was enough. Until the invitation. Evelyn's world revolved around appearances. Her calendar was a masterpiece of calculated social positioning. She knew which events to attend, which charities to support, which people to be seen with. Her upcoming birthday gala was the crown jewel of her year. It wasn't just a party. It was a statement. A reminder to everyone in her circle that she was still relevant, still powerful, still at the center of everything that mattered. The planning had started months in advance. She hired the best event designer in the city, a woman who had done weddings for celebrities and galas for foreign dignitaries. The theme was old-world elegance meets modern luxury. Think Gatsby but with better lighting and a more exclusive guest list. The invitations alone cost a small fortune. Thick cream cardstock with gold-embossed lettering, hand-delivered in silk-lined boxes. Only 200 people would be invited. And every single one of them mattered. Or so Evelyn thought. But to understand what happened that night, you need to know who Samuel Carter really was. Not the quiet man in the dark suit who opened car doors and kept his eyes down. But the man he used to be. The man he had buried so deeply that even he sometimes forgot. Samuel grew up in a small town in Connecticut, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and Friday night football games were the biggest event of the week. His father, Robert Carter, was a carpenter. Not the kind who built fancy custom homes for rich clients, but the kind who repaired broken porches and fixed sagging roofs for neighbors who paid in casseroles and thank yous. His mother, Diane, was a librarian at the local elementary school. She smelled like old books and lavender soap, and she read to Samuel every night before bed, instilling in him a love of stories and a hunger for knowledge. They didn't have much money, but they had something more important. Integrity. Respect. A belief that how you treated people mattered more than what you owned. Samuel learned to work hard. He mowed lawns in the summer, shoveled driveways in the winter, and saved every penny for college. His parents never pressured him, but he felt the weight of their sacrifices. The way his father's hands ached at the end of the day. The way his mother stretched every dollar until it screamed. He wanted to make them proud. And he did. Samuel was brilliant. Not just smart, but genuinely gifted. He devoured books, aced every test, won academic competitions without breaking a sweat. His teachers told him he could go anywhere, be anything. And when he graduated high school as valedictorian, he had his pick of scholarships. He chose Yale. Full ride. His parents cried the day he left, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride. At Yale, Samuel thrived. He studied political science and philosophy, joined the debate team, wrote for the student newspaper. He was serious, focused, driven not by ambition for wealth or fame, but by a genuine desire to make the world a little more just. After Yale, he went to Harvard Law. Again, on scholarship. Again, at the top of his class. He could have gone into corporate law, made a fortune defending banks and pharmaceutical companies. But that wasn't who he was. Samuel wanted to serve. To use his mind and his education to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. So after graduation, he became a public defender. The pay was terrible. The hours were worse. But the work mattered. He defended people who had been failed by the system, who couldn't afford expensive lawyers, who were drowning in a justice system that valued money over truth. He won cases that seemed impossible. He exposed corruption. He fought for the powerless. And slowly, steadily, his reputation grew. By the time Samuel was 32, he had become something rare. A lawyer that both sides respected. Defense attorneys admired his integrity. Prosecutors knew he wouldn't play dirty. Judges trusted his word. And when a seat opened up on the federal bench, Samuel's name rose to the top of the list. He was young for a judge. Too young, some said. But his record spoke for itself. He was nominated, confirmed, and sworn in on a cold January morning, his parents sitting in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. Judge Samuel Carter. It sounded impossible. A carpenter's son from a small town in Connecticut, now one of the most powerful legal voices in the state. Samuel took the responsibility seriously. He presided over complex cases, financial fraud, organized crime, environmental violations, civil rights abuses. He was fair, thoughtful, unshakable. He didn't let personal feelings cloud his judgment. He didn't let power or influence sway his decisions. And that made him dangerous. Because in a world where money could buy almost anything, Samuel Carter couldn't be bought. He married a woman named Margaret in his second year on the bench. She was a literature professor at a private school in Brooklyn, quiet and thoughtful, with a love for poetry and old movies. They met at a charity fundraiser, one of the few social events Samuel actually enjoyed. She didn't care about his title or his position. She liked him because he listened, because he asked questions, because he cared about ideas and people and truth. They got married in a small ceremony, just family and close friends, and moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. They talked about having children someday. About growing old together. About building a life rooted in purpose and love rather than wealth and status. For a while, everything was perfect. Samuel's career was thriving. His marriage was strong. His parents were proud. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And then came the case that would destroy everything. The case was straightforward, at least on paper. A prominent real estate developer named Jonathan Mercer was accused of fraud, bribery, and reckless endangerment. He had cut corners on construction projects, bribed inspectors to overlook safety violations, and displaced hundreds of low-income tenants to make room for luxury developments. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records. Testimonies. Paper trails that led directly to Mercer's desk. Samuel reviewed the case thoroughly. There was no question in his mind. Mercer was guilty. And Samuel was prepared to rule accordingly. But Mercer was not a man who accepted defeat. He had money. Connections. Power that stretched into the highest levels of government and business. He had judges, politicians, and prosecutors in his pocket. And when it became clear that Samuel Carter could not be bought, Mercer decided to destroy him instead. It started with subtle pressure. Anonymous calls. Veiled threats. Suggestions that it would be in Samuel's best interest to reconsider his position. Samuel ignored them. Then came the media leaks. Someone, it was never clear who, fed stories to reporters suggesting that Samuel had financial ties to a defendant in a previous case. That he had accepted money under the table. That his rulings were not as clean as they appeared. The accusations were absurd. Completely fabricated. But in the court of public opinion, truth doesn't matter as much as perception. And once the story was out there, it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Samuel's face was on the news. His name was in headlines. Journalists camped outside his home. Colleagues who had once respected him began to distance themselves. And even though no evidence ever materialized, even though no charges were ever filed, the damage was done. Samuel's reputation, built over years of hard work and integrity, was shattered in a matter of weeks. But Mercer wasn't finished. Because Samuel still refused to back down. He still intended to rule against Mercer, to hold him accountable, to make sure justice was served. And so Mercer sent a final message. One that Samuel would never forget. Margaret was walking home from the school where she taught. It was a Tuesday afternoon, bright and cold. She stopped at a bookstore, bought a novel she had been wanting to read, and then continued down the street toward the subway. Security footage later showed a man approach her near the station entrance. There was a brief exchange. And then she was gone. The police called it a mugging. Said it was random. Said she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Samuel knew better. He knew it was a message. He knew they had taken the only thing in the world that mattered more to him than the truth. And in that moment, standing in the morgue, looking at Margaret's face, pale and still and gone, Samuel made a choice. He could fight. He could expose Mercer, expose the lies, expose the people who had destroyed his life and killed his wife. But fighting meant more investigations. More danger. More lives at risk. His parents. His friends. Anyone he cared about. Or he could disappear. Take the blame. Let the world believe the lies. Let them think he was corrupt. Let his name be buried in scandal. And maybe, just maybe, the people he loved would be safe. So Samuel resigned. Quietly. Without explanation. He didn't defend himself. Didn't hold a press conference. Didn't try to clear his name. He simply walked away. His resignation was reported as an admission of guilt. The media speculated. His colleagues shook their heads in disappointment. And Samuel Carter, once one of the most respected judges in the state, became a cautionary tale. A man who had everything and lost it all. But the truth was more complicated. Samuel hadn't lost everything. He had sacrificed everything. For the people he loved. For the chance that maybe, in his absence, they would be left alone. And for 7 years, he lived with that choice. He moved to the outskirts of the city, changed his appearance slightly, let his hair go gray, adopted a quieter posture. He took odd jobs. Drove for ride-sharing apps. Did deliveries. Anything that kept him moving, kept him invisible, kept him safe. And eventually, he became Evelyn Harrington's driver. It was supposed to be temporary. Just another nameless job in a string of nameless jobs. But 7 years passed. And Samuel stayed. Not because he needed the money. Not because he had nowhere else to go. But because he had learned something in those years of silence. He had learned that there was a strange kind of peace in being invisible. In letting go of ego and ambition and the need to be seen. He had learned that dignity was not something others gave you. It was something you carried within yourself, regardless of how the world saw you. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon in late April. Evelyn was in the sunroom of her townhouse, surrounded by assistants, event planners, and designers. Fabric swatches covered the table. Seating charts were spread across the floor. Someone was arguing about whether the centerpieces should be white orchids or pale pink peonies. Evelyn sat in the center of it all, a queen holding court, making decisions with a flick of her wrist. She loved this. The planning, the control, the way everyone waited for her approval before moving forward. It made her feel important. Necessary. Powerful. Samuel stood near the doorway, as he always did, waiting to drive her to her next appointment. He had learned to make himself invisible during these meetings. To blend into the background like a piece of furniture. But today, something shifted. One of the assistants, a young woman with a clipboard and an eager-to-please smile, was reviewing the guest list out loud. The mayor and his wife. The CEO of a major pharmaceutical company. A famous author. A retired ambassador. 2 congressmen. A handful of local celebrities. Everyone important will be there, the assistant said, glancing up at Evelyn for approval. Evelyn smiled, pleased. Everyone, she repeated, as if tasting the word. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the designers, the florists, the assistants. And then, almost by accident, her gaze landed on Samuel. He was standing by the door, hands folded in front of him, expression neutral, eyes down. As always. Evelyn's smile widened. An idea sparked in her mind, mischievous and mean in equal measure. Why don't we invite Samuel, she said suddenly. The room went quiet. Heads turned. The assistant blinked, confused. I'm sorry, she asked. Evelyn gestured toward Samuel, her tone light, playful. Samuel. My driver. Why don't we invite him to the gala? After all, she paused for effect, shouldn't everyone feel included? Someone laughed nervously. Another person exchanged a glance with their colleague. The assistant hesitated, clearly unsure if Evelyn was serious. "You want to invite your driver?" she asked carefully. Evelyn nodded, enjoying the confusion she had caused. "Absolutely. I think it would be," she searched for the word, "delightful." More laughter rippled through the room. This time, louder. Someone muttered something about Evelyn's sense of humor. Another person grinned and shook their head. It was clear to everyone in the room what this was. A joke. A bit of cruel entertainment at someone else's expense. The kind of thing rich people did when they were bored and wanted to feel superior. And Evelyn, ever the gracious hostess, played it perfectly. "Print an invitation for Samuel," she told the assistant. "Make it official. Gold lettering. The works." The assistant nodded, still smiling uncertainly, and made a note on her clipboard. Samuel didn't move. Didn't react. He stood in the same position, hands folded, expression unchanged. But inside, something shifted. He heard the laughter. He understood the joke. He knew exactly what Evelyn was doing. She was inviting him not because she valued him, not because she wanted him there, but because the idea of her driver showing up at an elite gala was funny to her. It was a game. A way to amuse herself and her friends. A way to remind him, and everyone else, of his place in the world. And for a moment, Samuel felt the old anger rise in his chest. The anger he had buried for 7 years. The anger at injustice, at cruelty, at people who treated others as less than human. But he didn't let it show. He had learned, through pain and loss, that anger without purpose was just noise. So he waited. And when the meeting was over and the assistants had packed up their swatches and charts, Evelyn approached him, holding a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. "Samuel," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "This is for you." She handed him the invitation. "I do hope you can make it. It's black tie, of course, but I'm sure you'll figure something out." Samuel took the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. And in a voice that was calm, steady, and utterly unreadable, he said, "I will be there." Evelyn's smile faltered, just for a second. She hadn't expected that. She had expected him to stammer, to make excuses, to politely decline. But he had accepted. Directly. Confidently. She recovered quickly, laughing it off. "Wonderful," she said, though her tone had lost some of its warmth. "I look forward to it." That night, as Samuel drove Evelyn and 2 of her friends to dinner, they laughed about the invitation. "Did you really invite your driver?" one of them asked, incredulous. Evelyn giggled. "I did. Can you imagine?" "He won't actually show up," the other friend said. "Of course not," Evelyn agreed. "But it will be funny to see if he tries." They laughed again, and Samuel, sitting in the front seat, said nothing. But his hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. And for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to consider a question he had long since buried. What would it feel like to be seen again? That night, Samuel sat alone in his small apartment on the outskirts of Queens. It wasn't much. A 1-bedroom walk-up with a kitchen the size of a closet and a bathroom where the tiles were cracked and the faucet dripped no matter how many times he tried to fix it. But it was his. And more importantly, it was anonymous. No one knew him here. No one asked questions. He paid his rent on time, kept to himself, and lived a life so quiet it was almost like not living at all. He placed the invitation on the small table by the window and stared at it for a long time. The gold lettering glinted in the dim light from the street below. "Mr. Samuel Carter. You are cordially invited. Black tie. 8 o'clock. He could throw it away. Pretend it never happened. Continue living the way he had been living, invisible and safe and small. Or he could do something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in 7 years. He could show up. Not to embarrass Evelyn. Not to cause a scene. But to remind himself, and maybe a few other people, that he still existed. That he was still a person. That his worth was not determined by the job he did or the way people saw him. Samuel walked to his closet and opened the door. On the far left, pushed back behind the few shirts and pants he owned, was a garment bag. He hadn't opened it in years. Hadn't even looked at it. But now, he reached for it and pulled it down, laying it carefully on the bed. He unzipped the bag slowly, as if opening a time capsule. Inside was a black tuxedo. Custom-made, perfectly tailored, from a life that felt like a dream now. He had worn it to judicial dinners, to ceremonies, to events where he had stood shoulder to shoulder with senators and scholars and people who shaped the world. The fabric was still perfect. The stitching intact. It smelled faintly of cedar from the garment bag and something else, something harder to name. Memory. Loss. A past that refused to stay buried. Samuel ran his fingers over the lapel, and for a moment, he was 35 again, standing in his brownstone, Margaret adjusting his tie and telling him he looked handsome. He closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The grief. The anger. The exhaustion of carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. And then he made his decision. Over the next few days, Samuel prepared quietly. He took the tuxedo to a cleaner, had it pressed, made sure every detail was perfect. He polished his shoes until they shined like black glass. He got a haircut, shaved carefully, and for the first time in years, he looked at himself in the mirror not as a man in hiding, but as the man he used to be. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning. There was no one to tell. His parents had passed away years ago, his father from a heart attack, his mother from grief not long after. He had no siblings. No close friends. The people who had once known Judge Samuel Carter believed he was disgraced, broken, disappeared. And maybe he was. But he was also still here. Still standing. Still capable of walking into a room and demanding, through presence alone, to be seen. The night of the gala arrived faster than he expected. Samuel dressed slowly, methodically, as if preparing for battle. He adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, straightened his cuffs, and took a long breath. He wasn't nervous. He was something else. Resolved. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Evelyn pay for her cruelty or exposing her to her friends. It was simpler than that. It was about reclaiming something he had lost. Not his career. Not his reputation. But his sense of self. The knowledge that he was not defined by what had been done to him, but by how he chose to carry himself in the aftermath. Samuel took a cab to the venue. He didn't want to drive himself. Didn't want to arrive in the same car he used to chauffeur Evelyn around the city. Tonight, he would walk through the front door like everyone else. Like he belonged. The cab pulled up to the entrance of the historic mansion where the gala was being held. It was one of those old New York buildings that screamed wealth, with stone columns and arched windows and a doorway so grand it looked like the entrance to a cathedral. A red carpet stretched from the curb to the door. Valets in white gloves opened car doors. Photographers snapped pictures of arriving guests. Samuel paid the driver, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, he just stood there. Taking it in. The lights. The laughter. The world he had once been part of. And then, with his shoulders back and his head high, he walked toward the entrance. The doorman, a young man in a crisp uniform, glanced at Samuel and hesitated. He looked like he belonged, but also like he didn't. The tuxedo was perfect, but there was something about him, a quiet intensity, a lack of the easy arrogance that usually marked the people who walked through these doors. "Can I see your invitation, sir?" the doorman asked politely. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and handed over the cream-colored card with the gold lettering. The doorman scanned it, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Mr. Samuel Carter," he read aloud, then looked up at Samuel with new curiosity. "Right this way, sir." He opened the door. And Samuel stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the sound. Not loud, but layered. The hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the soft strains of a string quartet playing something classical and elegant. Then the smell. Perfume, expensive and delicate. Fresh flowers. Polished wood. The scent of wealth. And then the sight. The ballroom was breathtaking. High ceilings painted with murals of angels and clouds. Chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a palace, dripping with crystal and light. Long tables draped in white linen, covered with elaborate centerpieces of white orchids and soft candlelight. Everywhere he looked, there were people. Beautiful people. Powerful people. People whose names appeared in newspapers and on corporate boards and in history books. And they were all staring at him. Not immediately. Not all at once. But slowly, like a wave rolling through the room. One person noticed him and paused mid-sentence. Then another turned. Then another. Whispers began to ripple outward from the entrance, soft but unmistakable. "Who is that? Do you know him? Wait, is that?" Samuel didn't rush. He stepped into the room with the same calm, measured pace he had carried for the past 7 years. His face was neutral. His eyes scanned the room, not searching, just observing. And then someone recognized him. A man in his 60s, silver hair, tailored suit, standing near the bar with a glass of scotch in his hand. His face went pale. His mouth opened slightly. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Samuel." The name traveled. Samuel. Samuel Carter. Is that Samuel Carter? More heads turned. More whispers. And now the room wasn't just noticing him. It was reacting. Because some of these people, the older ones, the ones who had been around long enough to remember, knew exactly who he was. They remembered Judge Samuel Carter. They remembered the scandal. They remembered the resignation. They remembered the man who had disappeared. And now, impossibly, he was standing in front of them. At a gala. In a tuxedo. Looking like he had every right to be there. Evelyn Harrington was standing near the center of the room, laughing with a group of friends, champagne glass in hand. She was mid-story, something funny about a recent trip to the Hamptons, when she noticed the shift in the room. The way conversations were dying. The way people were looking toward the entrance. She turned, annoyed, expecting to see someone important arriving late. A celebrity maybe. Or a politician. But instead, she saw Samuel. Her driver. Standing in the doorway. Wearing a tuxedo that looked like it cost more than she paid him in a month. And worse, people were staring at him. Not with amusement. Not with the mocking curiosity she had expected. But with something else. Something that looked almost like respect. Her heart dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to actually come. And he definitely wasn't supposed to look like that. Confident. Composed. Like he belonged. She set her champagne glass down on a nearby table, her hands suddenly unsteady. And for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Harrington felt something she wasn't used to feeling. Fear. Samuel moved deeper into the room. He didn't approach anyone. Didn't introduce himself. He simply walked, slowly, deliberately, as if the room was his and everyone else was the guest. And as he walked, people began to approach him. The silver-haired man from the bar was first. Richard Langford. A defense attorney Samuel had worked with years ago. He crossed the room quickly, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like shame. "Samuel," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. "I thought, he trailed off. "You thought I was gone," Samuel finished for him, his voice calm. Richard nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "What happened to you, Richard, was wrong. We all knew it." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Then why didn't anyone say anything?" Richard opened his mouth but no words came out. What could he say? That he had been afraid. That it was easier to believe the lies than to fight them. That he had chosen his career over the truth. Samuel didn't wait for an answer. He simply placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, a brief, forgiving gesture, and moved on. But the interaction had been noticed. And now more people were coming forward. A retired judge. A former colleague. A journalist who had written one of the few articles questioning the accusations against Samuel. They came, one by one, some apologizing, some simply staring in disbelief, some asking questions Samuel didn't answer. And through it all, Samuel remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't make accusations. Didn't demand anything. He simply existed. And somehow, that was more powerful than any speech he could have given. Because his presence alone was forcing everyone in that room to confront something they had tried very hard to forget. That they had abandoned him. That they had believed lies because it was easier than seeking the truth. That they had let a good man be destroyed because standing up for him would have been inconvenient. Evelyn watched from across the room, her face growing paler with each passing moment. She didn't understand what was happening. Why were people treating him like this? Why were they looking at him with guilt and respect and something close to reverence? Her assistant appeared at her elbow, phone in hand, face pale. "Ma'am," she whispered urgently. I think he used to be someone." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The assistant turned her phone toward Evelyn. On the screen was an old news article. The headline read, "Federal Judge Resigns Amid Scandal." And below it, a photo. A younger Samuel. Clean-shaven. Serious. Wearing judicial robes. Judge Samuel Carter. Evelyn's hands went cold. Her mind raced. She had invited a judge. A federal judge. As a joke. She had mocked him, laughed about him, treated him like he was nothing. And now he was standing in her ballroom, surrounded by people who remembered him, people who knew what he had been, people who were looking at her with questions in their eyes. She felt the room closing in. Felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes that were no longer focused on the elegance of the party or the beauty of the decorations, but on the quiet man in the perfect tuxedo who had just walked in and changed everything. This was supposed to be her night. Her moment. Her celebration. But in the span of 5 minutes, Samuel Carter had taken it from her. Not with words. Not with accusations. But simply by showing up. By being seen. By refusing to stay invisible. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what's about to happen next is going to blow your mind. The truth that Samuel carried for 7 years is about to come out. And when it does, it will expose not just Evelyn, but an entire network of power, corruption, and lies that reaches further than anyone in that room could imagine. Stay with me. Don't click away now. Because the revelation is coming, and you need to hear every single word. Evelyn's mind raced. She needed to regain control. This was her event, her home, her world. She couldn't let this man, this driver, upend everything she had built. She set her shoulders back, put on her most gracious smile, and began walking toward Samuel. Every step felt like moving through water. Her legs were unsteady, her heart pounding, but she forced herself forward. She would confront this. She would handle it the way she handled everything else. With charm, with poise, with the unshakable confidence that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted. She reached Samuel just as another guest, a woman in her 70s with pearls and perfectly set gray hair, was speaking to him. "I always believed you were innocent," the woman was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "I want you to know that." Samuel nodded politely. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. That means more than you know." Evelyn stepped into the conversation, her smile bright but her eyes hard. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume that people nearby could hear. "I'm so glad you could make it." Samuel turned to face her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. And in that moment, Evelyn saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not anger. Not hatred. But a quiet, unshakable certainty. The look of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Of course," Samuel said simply. "You invited me." Evelyn laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, well, she hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. "I wanted to make sure everyone felt welcome." Samuel nodded slowly. "Everyone," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Harrington." There was something in the way he said her name. Not disrespectful, but not quite respectful either. Formal. Distant. As if he were addressing a stranger rather than someone he had worked for 7 years. Evelyn felt a flash of irritation. She didn't like the way people were watching them. Didn't like the way the power dynamic had somehow shifted. "I hope you're enjoying yourself," she said, trying to regain her footing. "It's quite a party." Samuel looked around the room slowly. The chandeliers. The flowers. The people in their expensive clothes, holding their expensive drinks, living their expensive lives. "It's very impressive," he said. "You've built quite a world for yourself." There was something in his tone. Not accusation exactly, but something close to it. Evelyn's smile tightened. "I've been very fortunate," she said carefully. "Fortune," Samuel repeated. "Is that what you call it?" The air between them grew tense. People nearby had stopped their own conversations and were openly listening now. Evelyn felt trapped. She wanted to walk away, to laugh it off, to dismiss him the way she had dismissed him for 7 years. But something told her that if she walked away now, she would lose something far more important than just this conversation. Before she could respond, a man stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, distinguished, with steel-gray hair and a commanding presence. Thomas Whitmore. A prominent attorney and close friend of Evelyn's late husband. He had been watching the exchange with growing concern. "Samuel," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "It's been a long time." Samuel turned to face him. "Tom," he acknowledged. "Yes, it has." Thomas extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Samuel shook it. "I heard you left the bench," Thomas said carefully. "I was sorry to hear about everything that happened." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Were you?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "We all were. It was a difficult situation." "A difficult situation," Samuel repeated, and for the first time, there was an edge to his voice. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Thomas glanced at Evelyn, then back at Samuel. "Look, Samuel, I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish by being here tonight, but I'm not hoping to accomplish anything," Samuel interrupted. "I was invited. I accepted. That's all." "Then why?" Evelyn started, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "Why did you come?" Samuel looked at her. Really looked at her. And in that moment, Evelyn saw something that terrified her. Not anger. Not resentment. But pity. "Because I wanted to see," Samuel said quietly, "if any of you would recognize me. If any of you would remember. If any of you would care." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. 200 people, all watching, all waiting. Evelyn felt her face flush. This was spiraling out of control. She needed to end this. Now. I think perhaps, she began, her voice shaking slightly, this isn't the right time or place for what? Samuel asked. For the truth. Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. She had no response. And into that silence, another voice spoke. It came from near the bar. A man in his 50s, slightly overweight, with thinning hair and an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the nervous sweat on his forehead. Jonathan Mercer. The real estate developer. The man whose case had destroyed Samuel's life. He had been standing in the shadows, hoping not to be noticed, but now he stepped forward, his face pale but his expression defiant. I think we've all heard enough, Mercer said loudly. This man, he gestured at Samuel, was removed from the bench for corruption. He's a disgrace. Whatever he's trying to do here, whatever lies he's trying to spread, I won't stand for it. The room erupted in whispers. People looked between Mercer and Samuel, uncertain, confused. Samuel turned slowly to face Mercer. And for the first time since he had arrived, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't cruel either. It was simply knowing. Hello, Jonathan, Samuel said quietly. It's been a long time. Mercer's jaw tightened. I have nothing to say to you. Samuel nodded. I didn't expect you would. But I have quite a bit to say about you. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice desperate now. Samuel, please, this is my home, my event, I think everyone here deserves to know the truth, Samuel continued, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent room. About what really happened 10 years ago. About why I resigned. About who was really corrupt. Mercer's face turned red. You have no proof of anything. You're a disgraced judge trying to salvage his reputation by making wild accusations. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room followed his hand. He pulled out a folded envelope. Old. Yellowed slightly with age. But intact. I have this, Samuel said. Mercer's expression changed. The defiance drained away, replaced by something closer to fear. What is that? Someone in the crowd asked. Evidence, Samuel said simply. Evidence that I've carried with me for 10 years. Evidence that proves Jonathan Mercer and several of his associates fabricated the accusations against me. Evidence that shows who really paid whom. Evidence that connects the dots between Mercer's empire and the lies that destroyed my career and killed my wife. The room exploded. Voices rose in shock, in disbelief, in questions. Mercer started backing toward the exit, but several men, former colleagues of Samuel's, moved to block his path. Wait, someone shouted. If you have evidence, why didn't you come forward before? Why did you wait 10 years? Samuel's expression softened, became almost sad. Because I was afraid. Because I was broken. Because the people who did this to me made it very clear that if I fought back, more people would get hurt. They had already taken my wife. I couldn't risk them taking anyone else. So I stayed silent. I disappeared. I became no one. But silence, he paused, looking around the room, is not the same as surrender. And disappearing is not the same as giving up. I kept this evidence. I kept it safe. I kept it hidden. Because I knew, someday, when the time was right, the truth would need to be told. Someone in the crowd, a journalist Samuel recognized from years ago, pushed forward. Can I see that evidence? Samuel looked at the envelope in his hand, then at the crowd, then at Evelyn, who was standing frozen, her face ashen. Not yet, he said. Because this isn't just about Jonathan Mercer. It's about everyone who benefited from what he did. Everyone who built their fortunes on the properties he seized. Everyone who profited from my destruction. His eyes moved to Evelyn. And she knew. In that moment, she knew exactly what he was about to say. Your foundation, Samuel said, addressing Evelyn directly. Your charity. The Harrington Foundation for Urban Development. Where did the seed money come from, Mrs. Harrington? Evelyn's mouth went dry. I don't, she stammered. Let me help you, Samuel said, his voice gentle but relentless. It came from Mercer Properties. A donation of $5 million, made just 3 months after I resigned from the bench. The same month that Mercer acquired the properties I would have blocked him from taking. The same properties that displaced 800 low-income families. The same properties that made him, and everyone invested with him, extraordinarily wealthy. The room was utterly silent. Evelyn felt every eye on her. Felt the judgment, the disgust, the realization dawning on 200 faces. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear, I didn't know where the money came from. Samuel's expression didn't change. Didn't you? Or did you just not want to know? Because there's a difference, Mrs. Harrington. There's a difference between ignorance and willful blindness. And I think we both know which one you're guilty of. Evelyn felt tears burning her eyes. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be her night. Her triumph. And now it was crumbling around her. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, exposed as tainted, corrupt, built on the ruins of other people's lives. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. You're not sorry for what you did, he said quietly. You're sorry that you got caught. You're sorry that your perfect world is falling apart. But you're not sorry for the families who lost their homes. You're not sorry for the lies you chose to believe because they were convenient. And you're certainly not sorry for the way you treated me. For 7 years, I drove you around this city. I opened your doors. I carried your bags. I listened to your phone calls and your gossip and your complaints about people whose lives you know nothing about. And not once, not one single time, did you ask my name. Did you ask about my life? Did you see me as a human being? Evelyn couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face now, her makeup running, her perfect facade completely shattered. And that, Samuel said, turning to address the entire room, is the real corruption. Not the money. Not the deals. But the way we treat each other. The way we decide that some people matter and some people don't. The way we build our empires on the backs of those we deem unworthy of our attention. He held up the envelope again. This evidence will be given to the proper authorities. Jonathan Mercer will face justice. And everyone who profited from his crimes, he paused, looking meaningfully around the room, will have to answer for their complicity. But the real question, the question each of you needs to ask yourselves tonight, is this. How many other people have you overlooked? How many other lives have you dismissed as unimportant? How many other Samuels are out there, invisible to you, carrying stories you'll never hear because you never bothered to ask? The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel folded the envelope and placed it back in his jacket. Then, with a slight nod to the room, he turned and began walking toward the exit. Wait, someone called out. A woman's voice. Samuel stopped and turned. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly woman with pearls who had spoken to him earlier. She was crying. What happened to you was unforgivable, she said, her voice shaking. And we, all of us, we failed you. We should have fought for you. We should have demanded the truth. But we didn't. And I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. Samuel's expression softened. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more than you know. But it's not your shame to carry. The people who did this, who lied and manipulated and destroyed, they're the ones who should be ashamed. You, all of you who are listening now, you have a choice. You can continue living the way you have been, blind and comfortable and complicit. Or you can open your eyes. You can ask questions. You can see the people around you, really see them, and treat them with the dignity they deserve. Samuel walked out of the ballroom. The massive doors closed behind him with a soft, final thud. And for several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. They just stood there, 200 of New York's most powerful people, frozen in the wreckage of their own complicity. Then, slowly, the room came back to life. Whispers at first. Then conversations. Then arguments. Some people defended Evelyn, saying she couldn't have known, that it wasn't fair to blame her. Others were furious, demanding answers, demanding accountability. Several people left immediately, not wanting to be associated with the scandal that was clearly about to break. Journalists in attendance were already on their phones, calling editors, typing notes, knowing they had just witnessed something that would dominate headlines for weeks. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the room, mascara streaked down her face, champagne glass forgotten on a nearby table. Her friends had disappeared. Her allies had scattered. And she realized, with a crushing sense of finality, that her life as she knew it was over. Jonathan Mercer tried to leave through a side exit, but he was stopped by Richard Langford and 2 other attorneys who informed him, in no uncertain terms, that he needed to stay until the police arrived. Someone had already called them. The evidence Samuel had mentioned would be turned over. And this time, there would be no escape. Outside, Samuel stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cool night air. The city stretched out around him, vast and indifferent and beautiful. He felt lighter than he had in years. Not happy exactly. The pain of what he had lost, of Margaret, of his career, of the life he should have had, that pain would never fully go away. But he felt free. Free from the weight of silence. Free from the burden of invisibility. Free from the fear that had kept him hidden for so long. A cab pulled up, and Samuel climbed in. "Where to?" the driver asked. Samuel thought for a moment. Then he gave an address. A small church in Brooklyn, near the cemetery where Margaret was buried. He hadn't been there in years. Hadn't been able to face it. But tonight, he wanted to go. He wanted to tell her that he had finally done it. That he had finally spoken the truth. That he had finally stood up, not in anger or revenge, but in dignity. And that maybe, just maybe, she would be proud. The cab drove through the quiet streets, and Samuel watched the city pass by, feeling like a stranger in a place he had once called home. But that was okay. Because he had learned something important in those 7 years of silence. Home was not a place. It was not a job or a title or a reputation. Home was the truth you carried inside yourself. The knowledge of who you were, regardless of what the world thought. And Samuel Carter knew exactly who he was. In the days that followed, the story exploded. Every major newspaper ran headlines. Federal judge's hidden truth exposed. Real estate mogul faces fraud charges. Socialites foundation built on corruption. The evidence Samuel had provided was damning. Financial records. Email exchanges. Testimony from people who had been too afraid to come forward 10 years ago but were willing now. Jonathan Mercer was arrested. His empire began to crumble as investors pulled out and properties were seized. Several of his associates, including politicians and business leaders, were implicated in the scandal. Evelyn Harrington's foundation was shut down pending investigation. Her board members resigned. Her donors demanded their money back. Her name, once synonymous with elegance and philanthropy, became a symbol of hypocrisy and corruption. She retreated from public life, selling her townhouse and moving to a smaller apartment on the outskirts of the city. Some people said she was working with investigators, trying to cooperate, trying to salvage what little remained of her reputation. Others said she had simply given up. That she spent her days alone, haunted by the realization of what she had become and what she had lost. But something else happened too. Something unexpected. Samuel's story inspired people. Not just the journalists and lawyers and activists who had always cared about justice, but ordinary people. People who worked invisible jobs. People who felt overlooked and underestimated and dismissed. They saw in Samuel's story a reflection of their own struggles. And they began to speak up. A housekeeper wrote an op-ed about the family she had worked for 20 years, a family that didn't know her children's names. A janitor shared a video about the corporate executives who walked past him every day without acknowledging his existence. A delivery driver talked about the customers who treated him like a robot rather than a human being. And slowly, painfully, a conversation began. A conversation about dignity. About respect. About the way we see each other, or fail to see each other, and the consequences of that blindness. Samuel didn't participate in the media frenzy. He gave one interview, to the journalist who had believed in his innocence years ago, and then he disappeared again. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't hiding. He was simply choosing peace over spectacle, quiet over noise. He moved upstate, to a small town near the Hudson River. He rented a little house with a porch and a view of the water. And he opened a bookshop. It was a small place, tucked between a coffee shop and a hardware store on Main Street. He called it Second Chapters. The shelves were filled with used books, the kind with cracked spines and notes in the margins, books that had lived full lives before finding their way to his shop. He didn't advertise. Didn't have a website. But word spread, the way it does in small towns, and people came. Some came because they had heard his story and wanted to meet him. Others came simply because they loved books. And Samuel welcomed them all. He listened to their stories. He recommended books. He made coffee in the back room and served it in mismatched mugs. And slowly, without trying, he built a new life. Not the life he had planned. Not the life he had lost. But a life that was his, quiet and honest and free. Sometimes, late at night, when the shop was closed and the street was empty, Samuel would sit in the old armchair by the window and think about that night. The night he walked into Evelyn's gala and reclaimed his dignity. And he would smile. Not because he had destroyed her. Not because he had gotten revenge. But because he had proven something important. That you cannot break a person who knows their worth. That silence is not weakness. That patience is not surrender. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. So what can we learn from Samuel's story? What lesson can we take away from a tale about a rich woman and her driver, about pride and humiliation, about justice delayed but not denied? The first lesson is this. Never underestimate anyone. Evelyn looked at Samuel every day for 7 years and saw nothing. She saw a function, a service, a pair of hands on a steering wheel. She never asked about his past. Never wondered about his story. Never considered that the quiet man in the front seat might have depths she couldn't imagine. And that blindness, that willful ignorance, cost her everything. How many people do we pass every day without really seeing? The barista who makes our coffee. The cashier who rings up our groceries. The security guard who holds the door. The cleaner who empties our trash. We see their functions, but do we see them? Do we recognize their humanity, their stories, their worth? Samuel's story reminds us that every person carries a universe inside them. Every person has loved and lost, dreamed and struggled, succeeded and failed. And when we dismiss people based on their job or their appearance or their station in life, we don't just insult them. We diminish ourselves. We close ourselves off from the richness of human experience. We become smaller, meaner, less capable of empathy and connection. The second lesson is about the power of dignity. Samuel could have responded to Evelyn's invitation with anger. He could have confronted her, yelled at her, told her exactly what he thought of her cruel joke. But he didn't. He responded with something far more powerful. Dignity. He showed up. He dressed impeccably. He carried himself with quiet confidence. And in doing so, he forced everyone in that room to see him, really see him, many of them for the first time. Dignity is not something others give you. It's something you carry within yourself, regardless of how the world treats you. Samuel spent 7 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human. But he never lost his sense of self-worth. He never internalized the way others saw him. He knew who he was. And when the moment came, that knowledge gave him a strength that no amount of wealth or status could match. In our own lives, we will face moments when people try to diminish us. When they treat us unfairly, disrespectfully, cruelly. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can respond with anger, with bitterness, with a desperate need to prove ourselves. Or we can respond like Samuel. With quiet confidence. With unshakable self-worth. With the knowledge that our value does not depend on other people's opinions. That dignity is not given. It's claimed. The third lesson is about the cost of silence. Samuel stayed silent for 7 years. He had good reasons. He was afraid. He was protecting people he loved. He had been broken by loss and betrayal and injustice. But that silence had a cost. It allowed the lies to spread. It allowed guilty people to prosper. It allowed injustice to continue unchallenged. And it nearly cost Samuel himself. Because when you hide for too long, when you stay silent for too long, you start to forget who you are. You start to believe the narrative others have created about you. You start to disappear, not just from the world's view, but from your own. Speaking the truth is terrifying. It makes you vulnerable. It invites conflict. It can cost you relationships, opportunities, comfort. But silence has its own cost. And sometimes, the cost of staying silent is higher than the cost of speaking up. Samuel's story reminds us that truth, even when delayed, even when painful, even when costly, is worth pursuing. Because truth is the foundation of justice. Truth is the antidote to corruption. Truth is what allows us to live with integrity, to look at ourselves in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. The fourth lesson is about the illusion of power. Evelyn seemed powerful. She had wealth, status, connections, influence. She could hire and fire with a word. She could invite or exclude people from her world. She could shape narratives and control perceptions. But her power was an illusion. It was built on money and status, on the agreement of others to play along with the fiction that she mattered more than other people. And when that fiction was challenged, when Samuel stood in her ballroom and spoke the truth, her power evaporated. Because real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, is not about what you can buy or who you know or what title you hold. Real power is about character. It's about integrity. It's about the ability to stand in the face of injustice and speak truth, even when it costs you everything. Samuel had no money. No status. No connections. But he had something Evelyn never had. Moral authority. And in the end, that was far more powerful than all her wealth combined. In our own lives, we often confuse power with success. We chase titles and salaries and recognition, believing that these things will make us powerful, will give us control, will make us matter. But Samuel's story reminds us that real power comes from within. It comes from knowing who you are and living according to your values, regardless of the cost. It comes from treating others with dignity and demanding the same for yourself. It comes from speaking truth, even when lies are easier. And it comes from the quiet strength of refusing to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. The fifth lesson is about redemption and change. Evelyn's story doesn't end with her destruction. It ends with her reckoning. She lost everything, yes. Her foundation, her reputation, her place in society. But she also gained something. Clarity. For the first time in her life, stripped of all the trappings of wealth and status, Evelyn had to confront who she really was. Not the image she projected. Not the persona she cultivated. But the truth of her character, her choices, her complicity. And that confrontation, painful as it was, gave her the opportunity to change. We don't know if Evelyn took that opportunity. The story doesn't tell us if she became a better person or simply retreated into bitterness and regret. But the opportunity was there. Because it's never too late to change. It's never too late to open your eyes, to see the people you've overlooked, to acknowledge the harm you've caused, and to commit to doing better. Change is hard. It requires humility, which is perhaps the most difficult virtue to cultivate. It requires acknowledging that you were wrong, that you hurt people, that you were complicit in injustice. And it requires action, not just words. It requires changing your behavior, making amends where possible, and committing to a different path. But change is also possible. Samuel's story proves that. He changed from a judge to a driver to a man who reclaimed his truth. Evelyn's story offers the possibility of change too, from a woman who was blind to her own privilege to one who could, potentially, use her remaining resources and influence to make amends. And in our own lives, we all have the opportunity to change. To see more clearly. To treat people better. To acknowledge our mistakes and commit to doing better. The question is whether we have the courage to take it. So let me ask you something. And I want you to really think about this. How many people have you overlooked in your life? How many times have you walked past someone without really seeing them? Without acknowledging their humanity. Without considering that they might have a story as complex and meaningful as your own. Think about the people who serve you. The person who delivers your packages. The person who cleans your office. The person who bags your groceries or parks your car or answers your customer service call. Do you see them? Do you know their names? Do you treat them with the same respect you give to people you consider your equals or your superiors? Or do you, like Evelyn, treat them as functions? As background characters in the story of your life? I'm not asking this to make you feel guilty. I'm asking because it matters. Because the way we treat the people we consider beneath us reveals who we really are. It reveals our character, our values, our capacity for empathy and compassion. And it has consequences. Not just for them, but for us. Because every time we dismiss someone, every time we fail to see their humanity, we diminish our own. We become smaller, colder, less capable of genuine connection. We build walls instead of bridges. We create hierarchies instead of communities. Now think about Samuel. Think about the choice he made. To stay silent for 7 years. To protect others at the cost of himself. To carry a truth that weighed on him every single day. Would you have made the same choice? Would you have the strength to endure what he endured? Or would you have broken earlier? Would you have spoken up sooner? Consequences be damned. There's no right answer to that question. Samuel's choice was his own, born from his circumstances and his values and his fear. But it's worth considering. Because we all face moments when we have to choose between speaking truth and maintaining peace. Between standing up and staying safe. Between risking everything and preserving what we have. And those choices define us. They reveal what we value most. They shape the trajectory of our lives and the lives of those around us. Samuel chose silence first, and then, when the moment was right, he chose truth. And both choices cost him dearly. But both choices were also acts of courage. Staying silent to protect others took courage. Speaking up, finally, after years of hiding, took even more. So what choice would you make? And more importantly, are you making that choice right now, in your own life? Is there a truth you're not speaking? A situation you're not addressing? An injustice you're witnessing but not challenging? Or are you, perhaps, someone who needs to listen? Someone who needs to open their eyes to the people they've overlooked? Someone who needs to acknowledge their own complicity in systems and structures that hurt others. Let me tell you something else. This story, Samuel's story, it's not unique. It's happening right now, all around us. There are people in your life, people you interact with every day, who are carrying stories you know nothing about. Who have faced loss and injustice and betrayal. Who have been dismissed and overlooked and treated as less than human. And they're doing what Samuel did. They're surviving. They're showing up. They're maintaining their dignity in the face of disrespect and indifference. And most of the time, we never know. We never ask. We never see. Because it's easier not to. Because seeing their pain would require us to acknowledge our own privilege. Because recognizing their humanity would require us to treat them differently. And that's uncomfortable. That's inconvenient. That requires effort and empathy and a willingness to change. But here's the thing. Those people, the ones you're overlooking, they're not going away. They're still there. Still living their lives. Still carrying their stories. And one day, like Samuel, some of them will find their voice. They'll speak their truth. They'll demand to be seen. And when that happens, when the invisible become visible and the silent become loud, what will you do? Will you listen? Will you acknowledge? Will you change? Or will you, like Evelyn, stand in the wreckage of your own blindness, wondering how you missed something so obvious? I need to hear from you. I need to know what you think about this story. About Samuel's choice. About Evelyn's blindness. About the lessons we can take from their encounter. So here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment below and answer this question. Have you ever been invisible to someone? Have you ever been treated like Samuel was, like you didn't matter, like your story wasn't worth hearing? Or maybe you've been on the other side. Maybe you've been Evelyn. Maybe there's someone in your life you've overlooked, someone whose humanity you failed to recognize. Tell me about it. Share your story. Because these conversations matter. They remind us that we're all connected. That we all have the capacity to hurt and to heal, to overlook and to see, to dismiss and to honor. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question something about the way you live your life, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Because we're not done. This is just one story, one lesson, one reminder of what it means to be human. And there are so many more stories to tell. Stories about courage and redemption, about justice and mercy, about the choices we make and the consequences we face. Every week, we bring you stories like this. Stories that challenge you. Stories that inspire you. Stories that remind you why empathy and dignity and truth matter in a world that often seems to value none of those things. So subscribe. Turn on notifications. And make sure you never miss another story. Because the next one, the one we're working on right now, is going to challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness. About whether some actions are unforgivable. About whether redemption is always possible or if some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. You don't want to miss it. And one more thing. Share this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's been overlooked, someone who needs to be reminded of their own dignity and worth. Or maybe it's someone who's doing the overlooking, someone who needs to open their eyes to the people around them. Either way, share it. Let this story reach as far as it needs to go. Let it spark conversations. Let it change minds. Let it remind people that every person matters. Every story matters. Every life has value, regardless of whether we've taken the time to see it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember what Samuel taught us. That dignity is not given. It's claimed. That silence is not weakness, but sometimes, speaking is stronger. And that the people we overlook today might be the ones who change everything tomorrow. I'll see you in the next story. And until then, keep your eyes open. Keep your heart open. And never, ever forget that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Treat them accordingly.